Hello, my name is Hugh Ramus. This is Cooking Up Crime, where I talk about true crime and eat various foods while I do it. This week we have yogurt, basically just yogurt. It's got Keepe's blueberries, powdered peanut butter, and then dates. This is just so I eat my servings of fruit every day. I eat this every day because I'm crazy. Anyway, my hair's looking a bit cockeyed. We're just gonna roll with it. So this week we are talking about Typhoid Mary. Get ready, this one's a doozy. I guess not any more of a doozy than the other ones. So, Mary Mallon was born September 23rd of 1869 in Ireland. When Mary's mother was pregnant with her, her mother had contracted typhoid fever while she was pregnant. However, both the mother and baby survived. Spoiler alert. When she was 15, she moved to the United States to live with her aunt and uncle and became a maid for the wealthy elite, whatever that is. I'm sorry I'm not looking at the camera too much. I'm trying to stir my dumb yogurt. I stopped eating in videos for a little bit because I hate the sound of me eating, but I'm hungry. Sorry. In the year 1900, she worked for a family in Mamaroneck, New York. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Or added in some letters there. But after working there 2 weeks, some of the family had contracted typhoid fever. And at this time, typhoid fever had a 10% fatality rate, meaning that 1 in 10 people died from this. So people were kind of like freaking out. And they were kind of like, you got typhoid fever, you're practically dead, you're dead, sorry. There was also no antibiotic or treatment or any sort of vaccine that could be done about typhoid fever. So really you were just stuck with it and you had a 10% chance of dying. I have to sit on my legs because I've realized that I'm not in the frame this whole time. There we go. In 1901, she moved to Manhattan, New York, where she worked for this other family. But some of the family residents had contracted typhoid fever and one of the laundresses died. I'm just kind of like a preface. This was kind of like when there was a separation of servants and like the family. So all the servants would kind of like hang out together a lot. In this story, you'll be hearing a lot about different servants catching the disease. And it's not like Mary was like purposefully giving it to these people. It was just that they were hanging out a lot of the time. She then moved on to a family of a lawyer, but 7 of the 8 residents got typhoid fever, so she left again. Here you have it kind of on, it's Mary. Typhoid Mary. She's giving it to these people. In June of 1904, Mary was hired by a lawyer by last name Gilsey. Gilsey? Something like that. And 5 of the 8 servants had gotten sick too. None of the family had gotten sick because the servants actually got their own separate living quarters separate from the house. A Dr. Wilson had investigated all of this from Mr. Gilsey, and he concluded that a laundress was the first one to catch it and she gave it to the other 4. Immediately after all of this, Mary left and then was hired by a George Kessler. But 2 weeks after that, one of George's other laundresses, there's a lot of laundresses in this story getting infected, and she was taken to St. Joseph's Regional Medical Center. In August of 1906, she went and worked for a New York banker named Charles Henry Warren, and he had like a summer home in Oyster Bay. But from August 27th to September 6th, 6 of the 11 house members were infected with typhoid fever. The landlord of Oyster Bay had hired an investigator to come out and to get the water samples tested. He had thought that maybe that the typhoid fever was being passed by the water, but all the water came back negative. So then they were just kind of like, well, what happens now, you know? Mary was then hired by Walter Bowen to work in his house on Park Avenue. On January 23rd, my birthday, in 1907, 90 years before I was born, lol, wow, one of Mr. Bowen's maids got typhoid fever, and then his only daughter got it and died. So it really hit the fan then, because at this point, none of the family members had got it and died. It was just the servants. So like, they didn't care. It was just the servants. And it was after this incident that people started looking at Mary, and they were just like, this broad, she's been at all these places that they've got typhoid fever at. It's Mary giving everybody typhoid fever. So the landlord at Oyster Bay, remember how he hired an investigator? Anyway, he had also hired a sanitary engineer named George Sober. He published his findings on June 15th of 1907 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And he was kind of like unsettled about this whole typhoid nonsense because when typhoid like was a thing, it didn't infect like the upper class families because it was more found in like unsanitary conditions. And when you're upper class, you can afford maids and different people who clean for you. So you're not like living in unsanitary conditions, you know what I mean? He was saying how that some of the clams were infected that they were eating, but some of the people who got infected were not even eating the clams. So what then, George? George kept hearing about an Irish cook that was being involved with all of these cases, but he couldn't figure out her identity at all. He then found Mary Mallon cooking for the Bowen family, where he outright accused her of spreading the disease. So he came at her, and she came right back with a carving fork and was like, "Get out my kitchen." And he asked for like samples of her DNA to test for typhoid fever, and she refused and was like, "Go back." George then collected her employment history from the Bowen family, I assume, that's me assuming, and found out that 7 of the 8 families she had worked for had contracted typhoid fever. So Mary had a lover, and I don't know his or her identity. I don't even know their gender or like their hair color. Couldn't even tell you if this is a real person. But according to sources, Mary had a lover, and George found out where they lived. So he took a Dr. Raymond Hubler, that's his real name, we're not laughing, to Mary Mallon's address and asked her to give samples, and she refused. And she thought that typhoid fever was like everywhere. Now, this was before the germ theory was a thing. Basically, people didn't know anything about germs. They just kind of thought that, like, by the grace of God, you either didn't or did got diseases. You know what I'm saying? And George Sober was able to identify Mary Mallon as the first healthy carrier in American history of a disease. In 1907, George worked with Dr. Briggs and Dr. Josephine Baker and the New York police to bring Mary in by force. I have to see what my ferret's doing. Hold on. They wanted to bring her in to get some testing done to see if she had typhoid fever like in her DNA. And she obviously wasn't going to go voluntarily. She refused and resisted arrest, for lack of a better word, for 5 hours before they restrained her and then took her in to North Brother Island, which had Riverside Hospital on top of it, for further testing. And she was tested positive for typhoid fever. She was then quarantined and given a cottage because they claimed that she was a threat to the public health, which I could understand why they would say that, but maybe forcefully quarantining her on her cottage wasn't the best idea. She was forcefully quarantined for 2 years, and 120 of her 163 samples came back positive for typhoid fever. I'm imagining like what happened when everyone came back negative, and she was like, "Woohoo, I'm cured, praise the Lord." And then we come back and be like, "Actually, I have 7 more that are positive. Sorry, man." How disheartening would that have been? You know what I mean? Didn't really understand, like I said before, like she didn't have like a knowledge of the germ theory, and she never washed her hands. They didn't know what germs were. We're giving them the benefit of the doubt. You know what I'm saying? But also, Mary was denied an eye doctor, but her eye was paralyzed, and she had to like put a band-aid over it at night to close it. I'm demonstrating, if you didn't know. My ferret's trying to climb up my bed and he just fell. My hair is getting really long and I'm deciding whether to cut it all off or not. It's just kind of being an annoyance right now. I don't even care anymore. After George published his findings that Mary was the first human healthy carrier, she was then named as Typhoid Mary, and she was called this in various cartoons. Even in medical dictionaries, they called her Typhoid Mary. And how upsetting that is. You know what I mean? It's like somebody like broadcasting your biggest insecurity and putting it in not only cartoons, but having it be recognized by the scientific community. Wow, disheartening. I'm aggravated for her, honestly. Especially since she hated being called Typhoid Mary. George went to her house one day, the cottage where she was being forced to quarantine without any sort of consent. And he was like, "I'm writing a book about you and I would like to give you some of the royalties," which I guess was nice. But she refused and locked herself in the bathroom until he left. She just didn't want to be associated with typhoid fever and Typhoid Mary. She said, quote, "I wonder how the said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park." Who's William Park? I guess I should have researched who William Park was. I'm sorry. I didn't think about it. I feel like he was mentioned earlier and I just scratched his name out because I didn't think he was important. But here we are. Milton Rosenau and Charles Chapin thought that Mary's disease could be controlled and that quarantine was not necessary, and they wanted to reach out to help her. In 1909, Mary actually tried to sue the health department after a nervous breakdown she had, but she was unsuccessful. No one bothered to explain the germ theory to Mary or why she was a public threat to everybody. They just kept throwing her into rooms in this cottage and making her, Sir, you're being a disturbance. No one bothered to explain to her the issue of what was happening and why she was a public health threat. According to my research, they didn't care about having her understand anything. They were just you don't need to understand because we do, and so it doesn't matter. Just do what we say. You know what I mean? Milton and Charles, that I just explained, they thought that maybe the disease was in her gallbladder. And they were like, hey, Mary, we could just remove your gallbladder. And maybe that would make everything go away. And she was like, you ain't removing nothing. I ain't no Typhoid Mary. And y'all get off my porch. I thought she may have said that. If she had a porch. I don't even know if she had a porch. They tried other methods of removing the bacteria by giving her laxatives or just trying to issue a way of like cleansing her digestive system and maybe hoping that that would like get rid of all the disease inside of her. But these were unsuccessful. Actually, as part of like her treatment, she was given multiple medicines and one of them actually severely damaged her kidneys. And she was never given any sort of like accommodation for this. In 1910, a new health department commissioner, Eugene Porter, felt sorry for Mary and he wanted to help her get out of quarantine and find a job that wasn't being a cook and let her resume some form of like normalcy in her life outside of this forced quarantine she didn't ask for and all these random tests being done to her. Mary was released on February 19th and found work as a laundress. Mary was upset because being a cook was like one of the best jobs you could have as a servant. Laundresses paid less than half of what being a cook did, and at some point she hurt her arm and couldn't work for 6 months, and then after that 6 months returned to cooking again because she just couldn't support herself off of less than half of her original pay. She then began looking to work for upper class families again, but none of them would hire her because they knew her as Typhoid Mary, and then so she then began looking for jobs in hotels and restaurants and stuff like that as a cook. And everywhere she went, typhoid fever would break out and then she would just leave immediately. In 1915, she went and worked for Sloan Maternity under the name of Mary Brown, and worked there for 3 months, infecting 25 people, and 2 of them had died. The head doctor of Sloan Maternity was Dr. Edward Cragen, and he actually asked George Sober for help, because apparently there's only one sanitary engineer in all of New York. He then started interviewing different employees and was able to identify Mary off of their description of her and her handwriting. On March 27th of 1915, Mary was delivering food to a friend and the police had actually found her, were able to arrest her and return her back to North Brother Island, unfortunately. In 1918, Mary was allowed to make day trips to the mainland, which I kind of feel like is counterintuitive to her quarantine, but I don't know that much about typhoid fever and its spread, so we shall continue. And in 1925, she was given a job as a lab technician for a lab on the island. On Christmas in 1932, a delivery man had stopped by Mary's cottage and found her on the floor, paralyzed because she had had a stroke, and she would never walk again. 6 years later, on November 11th in 1938, Mary would contract pneumonia and she would die at the age of 69, and she would be buried in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. And 9 people attended her funeral, which is sad. After death, a post-mortem inspection had found that she had been excreting typhoid fever from the gallstones in her gallbladder, which means that the people who wanted to take out her gallbladder, Milton and Charles, they were right about wanting to remove her gallbladder. So honestly, if she just would have removed her gallbladder, all this would have been prevented. There was also some scrutiny about this as being just a lie and just as an excuse to treat her unethically or to justify their unethical approaches to Mary by just saying that, like, look, we found it, it was in the gallbladder, there you go, case closed, people. And some people just thought that they were just like trying to cover up for treating this woman so badly. In the end, Mary was the first healthy human carrier in United States history, and she had infected 122 people, killing 5. And I just don't know how to handle this story because on one hand it's like, yeah, she's a public threat, but also if somebody would have just like took the time to let her understand what was happening, maybe it wouldn't have gone so bad. You know what I'm saying? Maybe she would have understood and she would have been like, hey, completely understand. Let me go to my cottage and live the rest of my days. Why did her lover not get it? Here's my hot take. Are you ready? I wonder, why did her lover not get it? That's confusing to me. You know what I'm saying? It makes me kind of wonder, like, maybe something happened and maybe she didn't have it since birth. Maybe something happened. I don't know. You got me budding. Anyway, let me know what you think about this case. I want to know what you think about Typhoid Mary. Like, was it unethical if it was one person to save the rest? You know what I'm saying? That's where I'm struggling right now. It's like, on one hand, one person infected 122 people and killed 5. Whenever she could have just been but no one explained it to her. This is where I'm struggling. Anyway, have a great day. Have a great week. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
I want you to forget your past lives and find me the new Christ. I want your heart to melt like ice in the midst of July.